The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Winifred always thought was a particularly cruel day for bad news. Not Monday, when you still had the numbness of the weekend behind you. Not Friday, when at least the week was ending. Thursday meant you had to sit with it, carry it through one more ordinary day, and then somehow sleep. She read it twice at the kitchen table of the boarding house on Clement Street, with the smell of Mrs. Hatch's boiled cabbage coming through the wall and the sound of rain against the single window. The solicitor's language was careful and measured, which made it worse. Words like "unfortunately" and "in accordance with the terms and the estate of your late father." She set the letter down and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that she had been meaning to complain about for 3 months. Bramblehollow. The house had been called Bramblehollow. She had not said the name aloud since the funeral. Her father, Arthur Cowell, had died in November with 2 women at his bedside: Winifred, his daughter by his first wife, and Rosalind, his wife of 7 years, who had a way of arranging her face into grief that Winifred had never quite trusted. The will, read the following week in a solicitor's office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, had divided the estate cleanly. The investments and the London accounts to Rosalind and Bramblehollow. The house, the land, 20 years of her childhood, to Winifred. Rosalind had said nothing in that office. She had folded her gloved hands in her lap and looked out the window and said nothing at all, which Winifred now understood had not been grief, but calculation. The letter said that Rosalind had contested the will, that she had produced a second document, dated 6 weeks before Arthur Cowell's death, which superseded the first, that Bramblehollow, under the terms of this second document, now belonged to the estate in trust, administered by Rosalind, pending sale. Pending sale. Winifred had grown up in that house, had learned to read in the window seat of the East Library, had broken her arm falling from the oak tree in the lower garden, had sat with her father on the front steps every autumn to watch the starlings come in over the fields. Her mother was buried in the churchyard half a mile from its front gate, and Rosalind was going to sell it. She turned the letter over as though there might be something on the back. There was nothing. She thought about the solicitor she could not afford. She thought about the court challenge that would take 2 years and money she did not have. She thought about her father's hands in the last weeks, how they had shaken slightly when he lifted his tea, how he had signed whatever Rosalind put in front of him, because he was tired and because he's tired and because he trusted her and because he did not know or could not bear to know what she was. Then she thought about something else. She had heard in passing at the post office the week before that Bramblehollow had a new occupant, not Rosalind. Rosalind had her own house in the city and no intention of living in the country. The estate had been leased, temporarily, to a man named Aldrich Vane. She stopped herself. Not that name. She corrected her memory. A man named, she had seen it in the local paper, the notice of tenancy, the Duke of Ashmore. Corvin Ashmore, a name she did not know, attached to a title she only barely recognized, who had taken the house on a 12-month lease while Rosalind's lawyers arranged the sale. Someone was living in her house. She sat for a long time. Then she went to the window and looked out at the rain on Clement Street at the gray afternoon, at a woman across the way struggling with an umbrella that had turned inside out. She thought very carefully about what she was going to do. She thought about it for 2 days. On the Saturday morning, she packed a single case, put her good dress at the bottom, and took the train north. The housekeeper at Bramblehollow was a Mrs. Aldrich. No, she caught herself again. She needed to stop filling in names from memory, from years of Christmas cards and the inside covers of cookbooks. She had to hold the real present tense situation in her mind, like a stone, cold and solid. The housekeeper's name, she had learned from the local paper's social column, was Mrs. Dunmore, a widow imported from the Duke's other household in the South. She would not know Winifred. She would not know Arthur Cowell's daughter, who had not been in this county for 18 months, who had lost weight since then, who had cut her hair in the autumn and now wore it differently. Winifred stood at the rear gate of the estate, which was where she had always stood when she came home from the village and wanted to cut through the kitchen garden rather than walk the long way round. The gate was unlocked. That much, at least, had not changed. She had answered an advertisement. That was the thing that had made it possible. The fact that there was an advertisement at all, that the new household needed a parlour maid and had said so in the Ashmore Gazette, that she had written a letter under her mother's maiden name, Holloway, and called herself Margaret, and that Mrs. Dunmore had written back within a week. Margaret Holloway. She had practiced saying it until it felt almost ordinary. She had not let herself think too carefully about what she was doing. If she thought about it carefully, she would see the edges of it, how thin the idea was, how easily it fell apart. She was a woman of 26 with a university education and no domestic experience, and she was about to walk into her own childhood home and pretend to be a servant. The solid facts of this, examined directly, were alarming. She went through the gate. The kitchen garden was almost exactly as she had left it. The same espaliered apple trees against the south wall, the same beds that her father's gardener had kept through all the changes of season. There was a new cold frame near the gate that she did not recognize, and the lavender had been cut back hard, perhaps too hard, but the bones of the garden were her father's garden, and she had to stop walking for a moment and just stand there. She stood there until she could breathe normally again. Then she went up the kitchen path and knocked on the door. Mrs. Dunmore was smaller than Winifred had imagined and considerably sharper. She looked at Winifred's letter of reference, which Winifred had written herself. Under another name, she would not examine too closely. And then she looked at Winifred, and for one moment Winifred thought the whole thing was over before it had begun. "You're thin," Mrs. Dunmore said. "Parlour work requires stamina." "I'm stronger than I look," Winifred said. The housekeeper considered her. "The reference is from Mrs. Ashby in Devonshire. You'll have come a long way." "I needed a change," Winifred said. She had prepared a version of this, a history that borrowed enough from the truth to feel real when she told it. She had been in service in the South. She was 24. She subtracted 2 years from herself to avoid any chance of recognition. She had no family to speak of. She was reliable and quiet, and she only needed a room and her wages. Mrs. Dunmore looked at her for another moment and then said, "Very well. You'll start Monday. His Grace is in residence from Wednesday. By that time I'll expect you to know the layout of the house." Winifred said, "Yes, Mrs. Dunmore," and kept her face as still as she could manage, because the layout of the house was something she had known since she was 4 years old. She had been afraid that it would feel like grief, being in the house. She had been afraid she would cry in the linen cupboard or stand outside her old bedroom door and fall apart. What she had not expected was that it would feel like anger, quiet, useful anger, the kind that kept her moving. She had been given a room in the servants' quarters on the north side, which in her father's time had been used for storage. It was clean enough and had a window that looked toward the kitchen garden, and she lay on the narrow bed the first night and listened to the house breathe. The particular settling sounds of old timber and plaster, the way the wind moved along the southwest eaves, and felt the anger arrange itself into something she could actually use. She needed to find the second will. She needed, specifically, to find the original. Her father's true wishes, in his own hand, before Rosalind had put something else in front of him. She was not a lawyer. She did not know precisely what she was looking for, or what she would do with it if she found it. But she knew her father. She knew that he was not a man who left things only in one place, that he had always kept copies, that there was a room in this house, the small study off the East Library, the one he had called his thinking room, where he had kept the things that mattered most to him. Rosalind's lawyers had searched the house. They had taken what they found, but they had been looking for a second will, not a first. They already had what they needed or thought they did. Winifred was looking for something different. A letter. A copy. A note in the margin of something, a date that contradicted something else. She did not know exactly what she was looking for, but she had lived in this house for 20 years. And she knew where for her hide things when he did not want them found. The difficulty was the Duke. He arrived on Wednesday, as Mrs. Dunmore had said he would, in a dark traveling coach that came up the East Drive in the late afternoon. Winifred was in the front hall when he came in, not by chance. She had arranged to be there, was holding a candlestick that needed repolishing as an excuse. And she looked at him the way you looked at something, when you needed to understand it quickly. Corvin Ashmore was not what she had expected, which she acknowledged was partly her own fault for expecting anything at all. He was younger than the title suggested, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the kind of face that gave very little away, and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent a long time being looked at and had stopped caring about it. He spoke briefly to Mrs. Dunmore, refused tea, asked about his correspondence, and went directly to the East Wing. Winifred returned the candlestick to the sideboard and went back to the kitchen. She thought, "This is manageable." She was wrong, but it took her a few days to understand that. The thing about Corvin Ashmore was that he was not what she would have called an easy person to ignore. It was not that he demanded attention. He did not. He was, in fact, unusually self-contained for someone of his position, did not require entertainment or deference, ate alone, spent most of his time in the library or out on the estate, and asked very little of the household. He said good morning when he passed her in the corridor, which Winifred had not expected, and which she managed by looking at his left ear and answering quietly. But he had a way of noticing things. She felt it without being able to point to specific evidence. He would pause, sometimes when she was in the room, not looking at her directly, but with a quality of attention that made her careful about her hands, about how she stood, about whether she was using the right words for a parlour maid, or accidentally using the words of someone who had grown up in this house. On the 5th day she was in the East Library dusting, which she had arranged because the East Library was adjacent to her father's thinking room, and he came in while she was there. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "You haven't, Your Grace." He went to the shelves, ran his finger along the spines. She kept dusting. She was very aware of the door behind the second bookcase, the one that led to the smaller room, the one she had not been able to get to yet. "Have you worked in many houses?" he asked. The question was mild, the way a person might ask about the weather, not suspicious, just conversational, the kind of thing that passed time. "A few," she said. "This is a well-built house, older than most in the county." "Ah, yes," she said. And then, because she could not help it, because it was true, "The East Wing is Tudor. The rest is later." There was a pause. She realized what she had said and kept her face completely still. "That's correct," he said. She did not look at him. "Most people don't know that," he said. It was not quite a question. "I read it somewhere," she said, "before I came. I like to know something about a house before I work in it." Another pause. Then he took his book and left. She stood very still until she heard his footsteps on the landing, and then she sat down in her father's reading chair, the one that still had the faint indentation from 20 years of the same man sitting in it, and she breathed. She had to be more careful. She found the first thing she was looking for, 11 days after she arrived, which was not the document she needed, but was something better in the short term. In the small drawer of her father's writing desk, the one with the false bottom, which she had known about since she was 12, and her father had showed her with the particular pride of a man who loved secrets. She found a letter, not a will, a letter dated 10 months before his death in her father's handwriting, addressed to his solicitor, which said that he was concerned about certain pressures being placed on him by his wife regarding the disposition of the Bramblehollow estate, that he was of sound mind and wished this recorded, and that his intentions regarding the property remained as stated in his will of the previous year. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. It was not proof that the second will was forged, but it was evidence that he had been aware of pressure, that he had been afraid enough to document it. And it was dated before the second will's date, which meant it was possible, more than possible, that a solicitor reading this would ask questions that Rosalind's lawyers had not wanted asked. She folded it carefully and put it in the lining of the small case she kept under her bed. She told herself this was progress. She told herself she would write to her own solicitor, the one she could barely afford, and that this letter would change things. What she did not expect was to be seen. She was coming out of the East Library, the letter already in her pocket, and Corvin Ashmore was in the corridor, not walking, standing, as though he had been standing there for some time, which was unusual because he was not a man who stood around. He looked at her. She looked back. The pocket with the letter in it felt very specific. She made herself breathe. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She registered that this was significant before she registered anything else. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, "Mrs. Dunmore said you've been spending time in the East Library." "I've been dusting thoroughly," she said. "It's a large room." "Yes," he said, "it is." There was something in the way he was looking at her that she could not fully read, not suspicion exactly. Something more like consideration, as though he was working through something slowly and wanted more information before he reached a conclusion. He said, "The family that owned this house before, the Cowell family, did you know anything about them before you came?" The name hit her like cold water. She kept her face still with an effort that she would have difficulty describing later. "I knew it had changed hands," she said. "That's all." He nodded, slowly, as though this was not quite the answer he had expected, but was not the wrong one either. "The previous owner's daughter," he said. "Do you know what happened to her?" She thought, quite clearly, several things at once. She thought, he knows. She thought, he cannot know. She thought, there is no way he knows, because if he knew he would say so directly. He was not a man who circled around things. She thought, he is asking me something about the family, and this is either a coincidence or a test, and I cannot tell which. "I heard she went south," she said. "I don't know more than that." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Good evening," and went back toward the east wing. She stood in the corridor and did not move until she was sure he was gone. She wrote to her solicitor that week. She could not post the letter from the village. Someone might see it. So she asked the driver who brought the weekly supplies from town to leave it at the post office there, along with a small parcel she was sending to a friend, which was not exactly a lie, she told herself, because she and Mr. Dowell. No. She would not use that name because her solicitor was as close to a friend as she could claim at the moment. The reply came 10 days later. She read it twice, standing outside by the kitchen garden wall, where she sometimes came to be alone, and the second time she read it, she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The solicitor said the letter was significant. He said it opened grounds for challenge. He said he would need to see the original document and that she should on no account allow it out of her possession. And he said, this was the part that made her stand very still against the cold stone wall, that there was a question about the witness signatures on the second will that he believed warranted examination. Something had not been done correctly. Something small and potentially decisive. She folded the letter and put it away and looked up at the sky over the kitchen garden, which was doing what the sky in this county always did in March, offering and withdrawing light in the same moment. She had been in the house for 3 weeks. She went back inside. It was at dinner, the servants' dinner, in the kitchen, that the cook mentioned it. The cook's name was Mrs. Parfield, a broad woman with a gift for pastry and a total lack of interest in discretion. "His Grace is expecting a visitor," she said, "this weekend." Mrs. Dunmore said, "That is not our concern." "A woman," Mrs. Parfield said, with the air of someone who knew perfectly well it was their concern. "Lady, somebody or other from the Alden-Mere connection." She looked at Winifred without particular subtlety. "He's not married, you know, widower. 3 years." Winifred said nothing. "3 years is long enough," Mrs. Parfield said. Mrs. Dunmore told her to stop speculating and pass the potatoes. Winifred thought, for a reason she did not examine, about the way Corvin Ashmore had said her name in the corridor, Margaret, with a quality of attention that she had been careful, since then, to interpret as nothing in particular. She passed the potatoes. The visitor arrived on Friday afternoon and was called Lady Westergaard, which was not from the Alden-Mere connection at all, and Mrs. Parfield seemed mildly disappointed by this. She was handsome and composed and wore her hair in a style that suggested she had come from somewhere that had better shops than this county offered, and she treated the staff with the automatic courtesy of someone who had been taught to be polite to people she did not see. Winifred found her, on the whole, unremarkable, except for the moment on Saturday morning when Winifred was carrying a tray through the main drawing room, and Lady Westergaard was in there with the Duke, not standing close, not touching, but arranged in a way that suggested a long-standing familiarity, and he was listening to her speak with an expression that was different from his usual closed-off attentiveness. He looked, very slightly, like someone who was being asked a question they were not ready to answer. Winifred carried the tray through and set it on the side table and went back to the kitchen without allowing herself to think about any of it, which she managed more or less successfully until she was back in her room that night, and then slightly less successfully. She was not, she told herself, in a position to have opinions about the Duke's personal arrangements. She was a woman who had walked into his household under a false name to search for documents that would help her recover a house that was being sold out from under her. She had practical problems. She did not have time for anything else. She lay on the narrow bed and listened to the house settle and thought about her father's letter, folded in the lining of her case, and the solicitor's response, which had said grounds for challenge, and she told herself that this was what mattered. Lady Westergaard left on Sunday afternoon. Winifred happened to be at the window of the linen room, which looked toward the front drive, and she watched the carriage go, and then she watched Corvin Ashmore stand at the top of the front steps for a moment after it had gone, looking at nothing particular. Then he went inside. She went back to counting pillowcases. That evening, without quite having decided to, she was in the main hallway when he came down for dinner, and he paused when he saw her, and she prepared to say something about the silver she had been polishing, which was her explanation for being there, but he spoke first. "You've been here a month," he said. "About that," she said. "Mrs. Dunmore speaks well of you," she said. "I'm glad to hear it." There was a pause. He said, "I've been trying to think who you remind me of." She went very still. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "No," he said. "I don't believe we have either." He seemed to be saying something slightly different from what the words were, but she could not yet tell what. "The Cowell family," he said, in the same tone he had used in the corridor 3 weeks ago. "I've been looking into the history of the estate, for my own interest, and I found a photograph." The silence that followed was quite long. "A photograph," she said. "In the library, in a book that was left here with the house. A family photograph, dated about 8 years ago." He looked at her steadily. The daughter was about 18 in it. She held his gaze. She realized, very tired. She had been careful for a month. She had been careful every moment, every word, every time she passed through a room that her father had stood in or sat in or loved. She was 26 years old, and she had watched her home be taken from her, and she had walked back into it under a false name, and she had found what she needed, and she was very, very tired of being careful. She said, "Did she look like me?" He said, "Yes." She said nothing. He said, "The current legal situation with this estate. You know about it." It was not quite a question. "I've heard some things," she said. "I've also been looking into the legal situation," he said. "Because the solicitor Rosalind Cowell used to contest the original, made an error on the witness attestation. A procedural error. One that under the relevant legislation would render the second document unenforceable." The corridor was quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the bare elms that lined the east drive. She said, "How long have you known about the attestation error?" "Since last week," he said. "And before that?" "I began to suspect the photograph subject was in my household," he said carefully. "About 2 weeks ago." She thought about those 2 weeks. She thought about how he had been in the library, about the questions he had asked, about the way he had looked at her in the corridor and said nothing conclusive. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't yet my business to say something. This is your house. You had a reason for being here the way you chose to be here. I wasn't going to take that from you." A pause. "Whatever you found on your own. I didn't want you to think I was doing you a service you hadn't asked for." She looked at him. She thought about her father's letter in the lining of her case upstairs, and the solicitor who had said grounds for challenge, and the 3 weeks of careful ordinary work she had done in every room of this house while holding all of that inside. She said, "The attestation error, is it enough?" "I think," he said, "that combined with other evidence, a letter, for example, that might have been written by the original testator expressing his state of mind and intentions, it is likely to be very enough." She let out a breath. "I'm Winifred Cowell," she said. She had not said the name in this house since the funeral. It felt different here. It felt like the name had weight that it had not had in the boarding house on Clement Street. "I know," he said. "I came here under false pretenses." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware. I don't know what to say about that," he said. "You could start by telling me what you found, and then we can talk about what comes next, if you'd like." A pause. "And for what it's worth, I don't intend to mention to Mrs. Dunmore that she hired Arthur Cowell's daughter as a parlor maid. It seems unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved." She stood in the corridor of her father's house and looked at the man who had been living in it, who had found the photograph in the library book and said nothing, who had looked into the attestation error on his own, who had watched her work through a month of ordinary days without once making her feel like a trespasser in her own home. "I found a letter," she said, "in the East Wing study, in a desk with a false bottom." He nodded. "And I think," she said, slowly, "that between the letter and what you've found, there may be a case worth," he said. Outside, the elms moved. The house settled. In the kitchen, somewhere below, Mrs. Parfield was starting on whatever she was making for tomorrow's breakfast, and the sound was ordinary and domestic and completely familiar. "Would you like to sit down," he said, "and tell me about your father's house?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yes." They went into the East Library, which smelled of old books and lamp oil and the particular dusty warmth of a room that had been well loved for a long time, and she sat in her father's reading chair without thinking about it. And then she looked at the chair, and then at the Duke, and he sat down across from her and said nothing about the chair. She began at the beginning.